Hi there, I am Julie Cohen here to talk today about the amazing, bizarre at times, and certainly bizarrely relevant documentary film Spaceship Earth, talking to filmmakers Matt Wolf and Stacey Reese. There's a lot to discuss and unpack about this incredible doc. I think the first question, people always want to know how a film started, and in this case, I have two theories. So I want you to tell me which one is the right one. Did you become aware of and get access to this amazing archival and think like, oh my God, here's a documentary? Or did you think like, wow, what an incredible story the biosphere was, and is this a time to revisit it? Let's go see if there's any archival footage to be found.
Well, it started when I was just doing some internet research and I came across these striking images of 8 people in bright red jumpsuits, like the band Devo, standing in front of this glowing glass pyramid. And I thought it was a still from a science fiction film. I didn't think it was real, but I quickly realized that, in fact, these 8 people had lived inside Biosphere 2 and that many of them were around and had not told their story in 25 years since the experiment. And then Stacy and I went to a ranch in New Mexico, and she can explain what happened there.
Well, so Matt called me. Actually, Matt started texting me in the middle of the night these weird pictures of Biosphere 2 and said, do you know about this? I want to make a movie about this. I was like, I'm sleeping. Can we talk about this in the morning? But he kept sending me more and more photos. And I remembered this because I'm a little bit older than Matt. And I remember in the 90s when this was a big media sensation. So I was immediately hooked on the idea of making a film and said, like, well, we should go visit some of the Biospherians and synergists. Those are the two groups of this film. They were still living together on this ranch in New Mexico. So Matt and I got ourselves kind of invited and got on a plane without, any financing yet for the film, and landed in New Mexico and met with all of these people. And as they were giving us a tour of the ranch, they opened up this closet and said, you might be interested in what's behind this door. And it was like a documentary filmmaker's gold mine. I mean, it was hundreds of, VHS tapes, beta tapes, 16 millimeter film reels. And like at that moment, we were just like, this is going to be incredible. And then it was really a question of how do we convince these people that had never told their story before in 25 years, how do we convince them to be part of our project?
Wow. Okay. Well, I want to hear about how you did that. I first want to just acknowledge and admit huge jealousy, because I've got to say, like, in almost every pitch that I've written over the past 8 years on archival docs, I always use the phrase like, oh, and there's a treasure trove of archival video, except that it's never really true. And like watching this film and then watching it again, for this, I was like, wow, they really did have a treasure trove of archival video. So obviously, though, the next step is real live human characters. So tell me how you guys started to find the characters that had been part of the Biosphere story, and how did you kind of select who were going to be your main vehicles for telling it to us?
Well, for us, this was really a project of reappraisal. Of course, when Biosphere 2 was this huge media sensation in the early 90s, it was ultimately rebuked and kind of regarded as this spectacular failure. So there's a lot of sensitivity amongst these subjects about, and defensiveness about the legacy of their project. And I think we needed to explain to them, 25 years had passed, and with, historical perspective, that this project felt incredibly relevant and meaningful in the context of catastrophic climate change and Mars colonization. And so we went to them with those goals, and they were interested in that. But I think we ultimately realized thematically that this is a film really about small groups and what small groups can accomplish when they put their minds together toward a common goal. And so we recognized these two small groups: the synergists who met at a commune in New Mexico that Stacy and I visited, and then the Biospherians, of course, who lived together confined for 2 years. So it was about putting together a network of characters who comprise these groups and to understand the inner workings and psychology of those two distinct groups of people.
And how many characters did you guys do research on and think about including in the film versus what ended up in the completed doc?
Well, I think one of the great things about that treasure trove of archival footage is that we sort of made this film in a little bit of a different way than I've made other documentaries. It was a little bit more like how you approach a scripted film. We went through and created this whole system for cataloging that archival footage, because even though it was this incredible gold mine, it was like not organized, not digitized. And so we hired two very seasoned archival producers to go and basically live in New Mexico for a month and create this Dewey Decimal like system of footage, of the footage. So we went through all the footage and realizing that so many different beats of the story, in fact, all of the beats of the story were basically covered in the footage. Then we sort of selected who were the best storytellers and approached those people. And we interviewed, I think we interviewed more people that end up in the film, but we were pretty good about figuring out, we kind of could tell because they had done so much, media at the time, like who were the good talkers. Matt was lucky enough to go to Biosphere 2 before we even started filming on a tour with Linda Lay, which he can talk about. And we met Mark Nelson when we went to the ranch. So we knew that those two were sort of key storytellers for us.
And what's remarkable about the archive too is that it spans half a century, and you literally see the main subjects of our film grow up on screen. So not only is it a Byzantine story with this huge web and network of characters who are all visible and present in the footage, but you really see them grow up. So we wanted to track the characters who are most prominently featured in the footage. And in fact, those story producers made markers through all the footage of every single character so that our editor and I could search by keyword and find all of those subjects. So it was a mix of finding the best storytellers, but also letting the material speak for itself and to show the evolution of time.
Right. I mean, I really like the way that the characters not only grew up through the course of the archival footage, but then as you're interviewing people now, you see them as true grown-ups kind of looking back and reflecting on their experiences for the most part, like a fair amount of maturity and wisdom that we, the viewer, can see they maybe had less of in their youths. What was the experience like of sort of joining characters in this process of reflecting on their high-profile past?
Well, I think we had to cut through the defensiveness, honestly. I think so many of these subjects were really burned by the media, and it was a process of educating them through practical experience, but also trust that we weren't doing kind of the same project of the news media from that period, and that they didn't have to defend their work, that we were coming to this project and believed at face value that there was a kernel of visionary aspiration there, and that what they did was a futuristic project that has enhanced relevance today. So I think what we did is allow them to let their guard down so that they could speak about their intentions without defending their work.
Got it. So going to people who are defensive to start with and had sort of bad media experiences in particular, that's obviously a pretty big booking challenge. Like how long a period of time, how much back and forth with the individual characters? Were there like flat out no's to start with, or like, oh, maybe thinking about it? Like, how did that booking process work, Stacey?
It was really about building trust, like in any of these projects, and also being really mindful of the fact that these people weren't getting any younger. So, our first thing that we really wanted to do was go and interview John Allen, who's in his 90s. And we sort of did that right off the bat because we felt like we could, sort of lose him. And so that was an interview that, we did right from the beginning. And then, there's a group of people that live and work together in Bali, one of them being the Biospherean Sally Silverstone. And as much as we would have loved to go to Bali, we really didn't have that kind of contemplated in our budget. And we knew that she was going to be in Los Angeles. And so, we made our way to Los Angeles, and through a person, a PR type person that she really trusted. We had a series of meetings with her, and she sat and gave us this really beautiful interview. That's really one of my favorites. And sadly, she died this summer. And so, Matt and I have said, like, you make these films because they become like a historical record. And oftentimes when you interview these people, it can be their last interview. And so I think we were really trying, we talked to them about that. Like, we really felt like this was a moment 25 years later to reappraise the story, but we also felt like this was a moment to get these interviews done, because it wasn't clear how much longer we would be able to make this type of film. So that was definitely something that was on our mind too.
I think sometimes people don't realize I've pursued projects in which that expiration date has expired. And there is an expiration date in historical documentaries. And I think we just got in there in a sense. As much footage as there is, it really is only activated with people who speak from an emotional and first person point of view. And we had the benefit of accessing people to do that. Not everybody was willing to participate, but again, it was such a challenge to tell a story with so many characters. When I make films, I really try to narrow the scope of who's speaking on screen so that you really get to know them. It's not a march of talking heads or experts. And that was one of the biggest storytelling challenges. But I do feel that by the end of this kind of epic story, you've come to know the unique perspectives and experiences and biases of the different subjects in the film. So we had more than enough, but we definitely were rubbing up against an expiration date, which is true of so many films.
Absolutely. Matt, you talked about the way that biosphere was viewed a certain way in the 90s as having basically just been a colossal failure. And I also remember the actual time and the people in the Devo outfits, and that certainly is true. How did the process of making this film impact your view of what this all was?
Well, I was 9 years old when the first mission of Biosphere 2 commenced, so I had no recollection of it. I came to it unbiased in terms of my perception of the legacy of the project, but I became very interested in the prehistory of the group who conceived of Biosphere 2, and it's an eccentric and sprawling, history of activities and aspirations that found its ultimate expression in this monumental project. And I thought by going back to that origin story, you really came to understand the logic of this group. But it was hard it seemed kind of random at first. And I had to do a lot of work as kind of a translator to help them show a continuity of vision that led up to Biosphere 2. And what I think is that this needs to be viewed as an experiment in a bigger sense than just a scientific experiment. Of course, there was scientific experimentation going on, but these were theater performers and artists and adventurers, really. So in a sense, this was a kind of human experiment to see 8 people in confinement, but it was also a kind of theatrical experiment, complete with the, space age red jumpsuits and the media spectacle of this spectacular Emerald City-like structure in the middle of the desert. So in a sense, I think people did not appreciate that spirit of experimentation and adventure at that time, and really came down on them for having a lesser focused or defined scientific point of view.
And Stacy, what about you? I mean, you may have come in with a little bit more of a preconception. Do you come out of this film with a sense of how we should all be thinking about the biosphere and what this eccentric group of people did and accomplished?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things is that this story took place just pre-internet. And so even though it was such a huge sensation at the time, it kind of quickly faded from collective memory. And so what was interesting is, as we were making this film and we would say, oh, we're making a film about Biosphere 2, people would, oh, I remember that. But it wasn't this kind of time like now where you can Google anything and it pops up. So I think that was a really, exciting thing. Like, I remembered it, but I didn't really remember it and every detail of what happened. And I think that for me, one of the incredible things about making any film, and this film in particular, is it really, really changed my my point of view about the subject. Linda Lay says something really beautiful, that, if everyone planted a tree from a seedling, they would have a very different relationship with the environment. When she goes and visits Biosphere 2, she can look around at all of those trees and plants and remember them when they were, just in their infancy, so to speak. And I really think about that a lot. And I really think that if everyone on this planet had that deep of a connection, we might be treating our planet in a different way.
And I think for me as well, whenever I make a film, I ask the question, so what and why now? And it was really important not to lock this story in the past as some sort of nostalgia trip, but to really think about its relevance today. And something that I thought was so unique and unexpected about this group of kind of hippies in the counterculture is that they identified as capitalists and they wanted to do business enterprises. And Biosphere 2 was always designed as a private business enterprise that was meant to profit when we could colonize Mars. But ultimately, the kind of troubled fate of the project was, I think, a cautionary tale about how capitalism and environmentalism are not the best bedfellows, and that, there's a contemporary political scoop that allegorizes that in a particularly poignant way.
And so speaking of,
give away that scoop.
yeah,
Watch the movie.
Speaking of all that, well, so there's this surprising to the viewer, I would say, moment when a young and much better kempt, I'll say, Steve Bannon appears. What was that like for you guys? When did you learn that Steve Bannon was going to intersect with this story, and how did you decide how you'd fit that in the film?
Well, I knew through my research pretty quickly that he was involved in this story, and right away it became clear to me that in a sense this is a metaphor. It's, at this time Steve Bannon had kind of taken over and hijacked Biosphere 1, which is what this group called Planet Earth. He had convinced former President Trump to, withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. And what happened in 1993 was that he had kind of staged a takeover of Biosphere 2. So there was a great metaphor there that was kind of served to us on a silver platter. But what I learned at one point was that there were these kind of clandestine recordings of Steve Bannon. And we had no interest in interviewing him. He takes up so much attention and space in a room, and we didn't want him completely sucking the life out of our film. So we had the good fortune of having access to these kind of creepy and juicy tapes of him, really condemning the central characters of our story. So we had fun with it. It's kind of one of those juicy things that you wouldn't expect to appear in a story like this.
Yes, I mean, so basically, you wouldn't have wanted him inside the biosphere because he would have sucked up all the oxygen, given the issues that oxygen has presented in this. Anyway, so speaking of the juicy surprises, what were the other, in that experience of looking through the footage or through the interviews? What were the things that came up as big story points that were kind of favorites for you guys?
I know for me, one of my favorite moments is when they decide to build a boat, which they had no idea how to do. And they go to San Francisco and they would decide, we're going to build this Chinese junk ship and we're going to sail around the world. And that moment where, they're learning as they're doing and they're building the boat, and you see them kind of, push back, and you think they're going to sink and they're going to all die and that will be the end of their story. But it was just so incredible to me that they were able to do that. And then they sort of set off in this great adventure that I would have certainly liked to have gone on with them. I think the pre-Biosphere story was so moving and so interesting. And we had no idea really that existed until we got involved in the story. So, once we saw that material and how great it was, it definitely informed sort of the structure of how we decided to tell the story.
And I mean, again and again, it was just kind of astonishing to me how every single beat of this epic story was covered in footage, and sometimes from multiple angles with really cinematic coverage with cranes and stuff. And to think that a group had been so meticulous and so kind of conscious of their story while documenting it, but that this footage hadn't been tapped was just mind-boggling to me. And one piece of footage that I particularly love is that before the mission, the theater company, which was called the Theater of All Possibilities, staged a play called The Wrong Stuff, obviously a play on the right stuff. And they, in these kooky kind of silly costumes, kind of parody all the things that could go wrong inside of Biosphere 2. So it's this strange and bizarre, but totally unexpected way of foreshadowing all of the problems that they would face inside their mission in Biosphere 2.
Right. Well, you know, there's always a lot of unanticipated things that come up in the making of a documentary, and then the releasing of the documentary into the world. But this one, really beyond any example I could think of, had the really strange coincidence of being released into a world in which we were all feeling a little bit biospherian, you know, because all of a sudden everyone's kind of trapped inside their home with a small group of people that, you know, they're going to have a long, intimate experience with. Obviously, you didn't plan for your film to come out in a time of quarantine, but what was the impact that it had on viewers and even on you yourself watching it in this strange new world, you know, context that we find ourselves in?
I know that Matt and I really joked about, we had like making this film, we had lived in our own biosphere for 2 years making it. And we often talked about how, you know, the power of small groups, and our own small group was our filmmaking team. But I never anticipated, after sort of premiering at Sundance and bringing together all of these people who many of them had not seen each other in years and years, which was such an incredible experience to have them in this packed audience in the theater at Sundance. And then only a few weeks later, being locked in and thinking, maybe I should call Mark Nelson and ask him if he has advice for what to do when you're quarantined. And I really did. And, you know, I couldn't believe that we had made this film about people who lived sealed off for 2 years. And now here we are, you know, 8-9 months into it, and we're still essentially living in Biosphere 2, basically.
And the reality is that we were the first independent film to be released during the pandemic, thanks to the creativity and resourcefulness of our distributor, Neon. And there wasn't a model for releasing a film in these circumstances, but I think there was a deep need for people to be entertained and to escape, but still to think about and grapple with the experience that we're having. As documentary producers, we're used to pivoting and thinking of creative solutions. And this was the biggest pivot one could imagine, not only in terms of on a practical level, how do you release a film? How do you ignite a conversation and get people to reconnect to independent film during these difficult times? But also, how do you reframe the themes and the larger significance of a story as the world around it changes? And I think that's often the case with documentaries. And I think this was just such an explicit example of that. It was really astonishing.
Yeah, I can't think of another example of the world shifting to become relevant to a documentary as it has for this. But congratulations on the film, which is so beautiful at times and so deeply thought-provoking, as well as being so relevant. You guys did an amazing job, so it's great to have this film out in the world, even if for many of us the world is just our living rooms and our flat screens. Congratulations, and I look forward to those who haven't yet seen the film seeing the film.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Julie.